Okay, good evening, guys. So, you guys can see this map. So, take a look at this map. See how small Israel is. See, Israel over here is that small, yeah. So, this is a small strip, okay? If you look at the big map, it's a small strip on the map. But this is a very key strip, okay? This is a key strip. Why? Because it connects 3 continents, and it connects down, it connects Africa. On the top left, it connects Europe, and on the top right, it Asia. So it's the gate to Asia, Africa, and Europe. So this is why we see that Israel is a very key place, and everybody wants a piece of this Israel because this is a very key trading route. Whoever controls Israel controls the major trading route in this area. It's like the center of everything. Take a look at what Israel would look in those days. This is Palestine, okay? It was also known as Palestine. And if you see, every house over here has been made of limestone. And this is how Israel would look in those days, okay? Or Palestine, as we say. Now, to start this class, I want to tell you something. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2, a dream was given to King Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And in that dream, Nebuchadnezzar, he dreamt that the Babylonians would be captured by the Persians would be captured by the Greece, and Greece would be captured by the Romans, okay? This was, dreamt first by who? Jacob, okay? Jacob in his closing dying years, he dreamt that, out of the tribe of Judah would come the Savior. But here we see that God is revealing to Daniel how this would take place. Now, before we begin the New Testament, there is a gap of 400 years, okay? Now, in the 400 years, what happens is that the Bible doesn't record what happens, but there are things that happen in those 400 years. God is weaving everything together, we can say. And what happens is, we, in that 400 years, we start somewhere where the Persians are. That is where that 400 years begin, okay? So the 400 years begin somewhere where the Persians are. Then there is Greece, then there is Rome. And when Jesus was born, he was born into a Roman Empire, okay? Israel was under the Romans, and we know that that was a total Roman empire. So look at this. There are basically, in those 400 years, if we start at Persia, okay, so why Persia? Because out of the Medes and Persians, the Medes first ruled, then the Persians took over, and the Persians ruled for majority of the ruling. So the Persians, Greece, and Rome are the 3 major periods, we can say. Now, under Greece, okay, what happens is there's a revolt. Because why? The Greeks want to make the whole world a Greek nation, okay? So here we see that there are 4 periods, okay? The first period is the Persian period, then is the Greece or the Hellenistic period, and then we see that there is Maccabean or Hasmonean period, and then fourthly, we see that there is a Roman period, okay? So these are the 4 main periods. So the first period is Persian, second period is Greek, third is Maccabean. The Maccabean happens under this second and third are happening at the same time, okay? This Maccabean revolt is happening under the Greek period. So there are three major, and here we see that there is a Maccabean, a fourth one that is happening under the Greek. So if you can picture these four periods in your mind, you cover what is happening in those 400 years, okay? Now, we can go into every step as to what happened into those 400 years, but we will not go there, okay? We will think about just the key, we'll think about the key events that happen during the, you want the slide, Akshar? Okay. The key events that are happening, okay? So the first period, Persia, okay? Persia, look at this. The Persians, if you look at the Old Testament, the last guy to write the last book in the Old Testament is who? Malachi, okay? So Malachi is existing in the Persian period, and alongside him is Nehemiah, okay? And Nehemiah and Malachi are almost the same, okay? Now what happens in the Persian period? So the first period, in the Babylonian period, what happens is that all these guys get captured, and in the Persian period, they all come back. Nehemiah is the one that is building what? The walls of the temple, and Ezra also comes back on a different trip, and he is building the temple in the Persian period. So during the Persian period, they're building the temple, and what happens, because Nehemiah and Ezra are allowed to come back, the Persians allow them to worship God, okay? So that is 430 to 420 BC. Then there's another period, which is the Greek, okay? So see, now when Persia was ruling, the Greeks got jealous and they said, why should the Greeks let Persia have all the fun? We want part of Palestine or Israel. So they conquer Israel and they start. So the major events in the Hellenistic period is from 334 to 323 BC, okay? So the first event is, how do these Persians get control? We see that, in Macedonia, Alexander the Great conquers these armies, and we see that Alexander the Great gets control of Europe and the Middle East, okay? So Europe and the Middle East is gotten control of by Alexander the Great. Now, what happens is, the first step is that Alexander takes control. The second is that Alexander dies. And when Alexander dies, two of his generals, okay, they conquer Israel. And what happens is, if you can see this diagram, not this one, sorry. Two of his generals conquer his, so Macedonia somewhere that side on the right. So what happens is that two of his generals set up camp, okay? The first one is Ptolemy. Ptolemy rules from Egypt. Then we have another guy ruling from Iran or Syria. From Syria, he's ruling. So Seleucus from Syria, Ptolemy from Egypt is controlling Egypt, is controlling Israel, sorry. So in 323 BC, Alexander dies and two of his generals take over his kingdom. Now, if you see, these guys run the kingdoms like dynasties, okay? Dynasties is like one king and his family rules till, that family is wiped out. So that happens in 323 BC. Then if you see, in 320 BC, Ptolemy and the kings that ruled after him, they controlled Israel, and they controlled Israel between 320 and 198 BC. And they allowed Israel to worship their God. And while that was happening, we see Seleucus, he sets up his kingdom where in Syria. So now there are two powers, Egypt and Syria, that want to take over Israel. And then in 198 BC, between those two generals, we see that Seleucus is able to gain control of Palestine or Israel for a time, and they still give the Jews religious freedom. And this happens in 198 BC. Then another event that happens is 174 to 164 BC. We see another Syrian ruler. His name is Antiochus IV. And when he begins to rule, he begins to Hellenize the Jews. Okay. So he burns all the Torahs and all their sacred scriptures. And because of that, the Israelites rebel in 167 BC. So the third period is the Hasmonean or the Maccabean period. Okay. Now, before you see that, what happens in that period is that a messenger from the Seleucids, they come to the temple and they say, you cannot offer your Israel sacrifices anymore. You have to offer Greek sacrifices. So they appoint a priest, or the chief priest at that time was Matthias. So Matthias refuses, but there's another guy who comes forward and says, I will do the sacrifices. Now, because Matthias is the chief priest, he gets offended and he kills the messenger and the chief priest. He kills the messenger and the Jewish guy who was wanting to do the Greek sacrifices on the altar, because doing Jewish sacrifices was going to be like you know like a abomination. Correct. So this is what was happening. And then what happens is Matthias and his sons, after killing these people, fled to the mountains. So Maccabean was the name given to one of his sons, Judas. Okay. So that is how we get Maccabean revolt. Now another Matthias's grandfather or great grandfather's name was Hasmonean. Okay, so that's how we get Maccabean or Hasmonean revolt. Now another party who wanted to join these guys was the Hasadins. Okay, they wanted to be part. Okay, they were also religious guys and they wanted to be a part of this. And because they wanted to be a part of this, they sided with these guys, these Maccabeans. Okay. Now, these Hasidims, they were very religious people. Out of them came the Essenes and the Pharisees. Okay, Pharisees formed most of the Hasadins, and the Essenes were a small portion. The Essenes were people who lived by themselves and they don't want to do anything with society. So they were the ones living secluded, while the Pharisees were more devout people and they were the more pious people who wanted to take part in society. So this is what the Hasidim means. The Hasidims were the holy ones. They were members, who loved the law of Moses, and they joined the Maccabees. Okay, so this was the revolt. This was the third time period. And then the fourth time period we see was in 63 BC. The Roman general Pompey conquers Jerusalem, and Jerusalem becomes under the Roman rule. So when Christ was born, this is Israel, and this is Israel under the Roman rule. Now, when you look at this diagram, we see that the 12 tribes of Israel are spread all over. Okay, and as I was saying before, Jacob said that the Lion of Judah is going to be the most important tribe. And even though the Bible centers around Judah, even those other tribes, make a significant contribution. So this is how, okay, God is weaving the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and we will shortly look into the contributions of these guys. So to begin with, okay, to repeat what I just said, to sum up these 4 periods, we see that uh, Israel was conquered by the Babylonians, or Israel. So if you look at this diagram, in 722, so at the time of Israel, okay, in the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6 specifically, Israel was supposed to be a holy nation. They were supposed to be a nation of kingdom, a kingdom of priests, and they were supposed to live holy lives, and they were supposed to be lives pleasing to God, and they were supposed to be lights to the neighbors. But instead, they followed idols, and they were not able to accomplish, the level of holiness that God planned for them. So when they disobeyed God, God taught them a lesson, and uh, as Israel is living their lives in 722 BC, you know, Assyria comes and conquers the northern kingdom. Now, Israel, after the time of Solomon, were divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Okay, the southern kingdom was basically Simeon, Judah, and part of Benjamin. Okay, so part of Benjamin, Judah, and Simeon, they are the southern kingdom, and all the other tribes are the northern kingdom. So in 722 BC, Assyria comes and conquers the northern kingdom. Then the southern kingdom in 586 BC is conquered by Babylon. Okay, so Babylon conquest is, where you saw the diagram I showed first. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is, Babylon will rule for some time, but the Persians, Greeks, and the Romans will come later on. So here we see that, so how did the Babylon captivity change things for the people? Because even though they were removed from Israel and taken to a foreign country, that is when the gospel actually began to spread. And why was the gospel spreading? The gospel was spreading because the Jews had 2 main beliefs. They believed in a monotheistic God. Mono meaning one, and theism means God. So they believed in one God, and they also believed in the law of Moses. So everywhere they went, people knew them by having faith in one living God and also believing in the Jewish scriptures. So that is what the contribution that the Babylonians made. Even though they captured these guys, the gospel was spreading because they had taken them to foreign lands. Now, under the soon after, what happened was the Persians came, and the Persians, started rebuilding the temple. That was their contribution. But then when the Greeks were there, the Greeks wanted to Hellenize the world and make it a Greek world. So everybody was speaking Greek. So then under the Greeks came the Septuagint, okay? Now in Egypt, okay, there was a king, King Ptolemy II, okay? And what happened was that this is only a fable and a tale, okay? No one knows if it's really true, but he had a huge library. Legend tells us that he had a huge library. So he goes to Jerusalem from Egypt, and he takes the chief priest and asks him for 6 scholars from every tribe of Israel, okay? So there are 6 into 12, 72 scholars he takes, goes back to Egypt, tries translating the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. They take 72 days, and in 72 days, the Hebrew scriptures is translated into Greek. Why was this necessary? Because the Babylonians had taken many Jews and put them in different parts of the world, and generations after generations were now being Hellenized in Greek. So they had to have some sort of scripture that they could read and follow. So the Greeks made the contribution of the Septuagint. So this is all happening in those 400 years, okay? This is what we are talking about. Now, 2 centuries before Christ, there were two political parties that arose in those days. In those days were the two main political parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, the Pharisees and Sadducees both were religious, okay? But the Pharisees, they believed in the scriptures. And in those days, when we didn't have prints, they had oral translations. So they believed the oral translations also to be inspired. And they believed in angels. They believed in afterlife. They believed also in the resurrection of, God. But one difficulty they had is that, they had great beliefs, but small things, okay, would irritate them. And they would point out the small things. And that is what the Pharisees were known to. Like, for example, in Matthew chapter 23, they asked Jesus, or, they point out things as, Jesus, how can you heal on the Sabbath? How can you eat food without washed hands? How can you sin? How can you sit with sinners? So these small petty things, bothered them. So that was the Pharisees. They knew a lot about the law, but they were not the law makers. They were more of the religious people that were there in the society. Then came the Sadducees, okay? The Sadducees were the ones that were the rulers. They were more religious in nature. They didn't believe the oral translations. They didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't believe in life after that. They didn't believe oral scriptures. And the ones that mostly were that faced the Sadducees were the apostles. So right up to the book of Acts, you see the Sadducees there. Now, if we look at the Sadducees, okay, the high priest came from the Sadducees, and all the top members of the Sadducees were part of the Sanhedrin. And there were some members from the Pharisees also, but most of the members came from the Sadducees, and from the high priest also came from the Sadducees. So the Greeks, in 334 to 323, they're trying to Hellenize the world through Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is building all these big projects, and he's trying to convert and get one world with one speaking language under him. Now, that was the Greeks' contribution. And the Romans, when the Romans came to rule, what did they contribute? They contributed law and order, number one, and they built roads for the Jews. So we see that the Romans contributed that. If there was a province, they had rulers over that province. If there was a district, they had their rulers over that district. If there were like Caesars or kings, not Caesars, but Caesars were there, but not kings. So there were like Caesars and pharaohs, and when they had the law and order, there was a structure that was followed in Israel. And Israel now actually had a structural, the church and the law, or the church and they were one, okay? So even the council that was present over there followed strict Jewish, laws that were biblical, okay? So that was the world that occurred. So this is a typical Roman road. in those times. It looks like there's just stone on top, but it's like a 4-layer thing. But this is what, the Romans contributed. And with roads getting built, transportation was able to go faster. I mean, I don't know how fast on these kind of roads, but they were able to have, pull carts and all those things. So this is what. So now let's talk about Palestine while in the first century when Jesus was around. So here we see in the first century who was the ruler. Herod the Great. Okay, the Romans are ruling. Herod the Great, and Herod was born in that place. You see that place down, Idumea. So he was born in that place, Idumea. And then when he became the king of the Jews, he was ruling over all of Israel. And this guy, even though he built great projects, he was a very merciless guy, okay? He killed his wife, he killed his sons, he killed his uncle, he killed his mother-in-law. Anybody that went against him, he killed them. He ruled from 37 BC to 4 AD. Now, Herod the Great had 3 sons, okay? The first son, as you can see, Archelaus, okay? The bottom left, Archelaus ruled over Samaria, Judah, and Idumea, okay? Then came his second son, Herod Philip the II, if you see on the top right, those 2 places, Iturea and Trachonitis, those 2, he ruled over those. And that area of Caesarea Philippi, that is the area that was ruled by him. Then the third son, Herod Antipas, was ruling over Galilee and Perea. So if you look at the life of Archelaus, okay, he was ruling Judah, Idumea, and Samaria, and he was from 4 to 6 BC. And if you see in Matthew chapter 2, when Joseph and Mary were returning from Egypt, they tried to avoid this area because he was the ruler over there. And he was a merciless ruler. So they tried to avoid that and go on from a different way. Then the second, Herod Philip II, I already spoke to him. We already told you Caesarea Philippi was under his rule. And then Herod Antipas, he was the tetrarch, and he is the one who beheaded John the Baptist, okay? Why? Because John the Baptist accused him of having an affair with his previous sister-in-law, okay? And we see that in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, and he was also involved in Jesus's trial, okay? Herod Antipas, okay? So I got notes for y'all guys. So y'all guys will follow this later. So y'all guys can go home and reread what I'm explaining. So after Herod Antipas, there are 2 great grandsons of Herod the Great, okay? Herod Agrippa I. And if you see Herod Agrippa I, he ruled over Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, and he ruled from 37 to 44. And he was, in Acts 12, what happened? James was murdered, Peter put in prison. Who did that? This guy, okay? And then, this is what happens, and he goes off, okay? Then Herod Agrippa II, what did Herod Agrippa II achieve, okay? He was from 4 BC. He was from, I think, he was from 50 BC to 100 BC, okay? He sided with, Fetus, okay, in Paul's trial, Acts 23. He's the one siding and supporting that Paul shouldn't be imprisoned, okay, in Acts 23. So, not Acts 23, Acts 25 and 26. So that's what happening, that this is what the Romans are playing, okay, because the Romans are bringing law and order. So they are the ones to make all these, who should go, who should stay. But so now, uh, while these guys are having, the ruling authority, as I've said before, uh, who was the one, who was the people actually in authority? It was the high priest and the Sanhedrin, okay? So they were the ones that ruled over, you know, uh, so there were three high priests, okay? If we look in the Gospels, one was Caiaphas, okay? He was the one that, yeah. So he was the one, the high priest at the time of Jesus' trial, and we see him in John 18, verse 13. Then we see even his father-in-law, Anna. He's a retired high priest, but in those days when a high priest retired, he still held the post because he was alive. He also took part in Jesus' trial. And that is also in John 18, verse 24. Then in Paul's time, the high priest was Ananias, okay? And Ananias, in Acts 23, verse 2, oversaw the Sanhedrin. So here we see that there was a high priest, and then there were members of the Sadducees and a little bit of the Pharisees that made up this council that ruled or took decisions. Okay. So, like if was doing something, they would say that is not the way you should do it. The scriptures say that you should do it like this. The church and the state were one. So this is what the council. So this is what is the introduction to like what's going to happen in the New Testament. So then there were also places of worship. So in those days there were two places of worship. One was the temple, and one was the synagogue. Okay, so the temple looked something like this. Okay, it was a massive structure. It was only in Jerusalem. And if a person wanted, there were several feasts in the year. The persons would go up, offer the sacrifices to the priests, spend a few days over there or a few weeks, then come back. But it was a yearly thing. Now, because the Babylonians had, taken capture and spread people all over the place, not everybody had the means to come to this temple. And therefore you had synagogues. And in the synagogue, what would happen is that people would have community life over there. They would be taught the scriptures. They would be schools. And what you couldn't do in the temple, you could do in the synagogue. The temple had the high priests, and the synagogue was a place of worship. If you see the Gospels, you always see Jesus going to the synagogue, opening up the scriptures and teaching over there. So that is where people would come, learn the scriptures. So this is how the temple was. This was finally built by Herod, so it bears Herod's name. And we can see that on the outmost courts, you have the court of Gentiles over there. People who are not saved were this. Then inside were the women's court, which was a center over there. And then inside we had the laver, the altar, the priest's court, the the tables to slaughter animals. And then inside would be the holy place. Now, even in that holy place, there would be a veil, and there would be a innermost, and that only the high priest was allowed in over there. Then in that place, you would still have the innermost was the Holy of Holies, and on the outside of it would be a veil. Then there would be an altar of incense, table of showbread, lampstand, and there would be a porch over there. So this was what the temple was. It was a huge structure. Not many people could go there, and a typical structure of a synagogue would be like this. It would be a big area, like a big house. There would be a central area, and there would be sitting at the corners of the This is what a typical synagogue would look like. Okay, this is a picture of a first century synagogue. Like you can see the pillars over there. In the middle over there, somebody would stand and teach the scriptures, and then on the corners there would be people to sit and listen to the scriptures being taught. So these were the two places of worship. Okay, and mainly these people had the scriptures that they had was the Old Testament, and it contained God's law and his will. They believed that there was one God and everything was under his authority, and he was the one, ruling everything. So that was the Old Testament. Then later on they got the New Testament, but this is what we have. Okay, the New Testament. So if you look at a New Testament, it has 27 books, 4 gospels. Uh, Even the gospels are very different from each other. Matthew focuses as Jesus, King of the Jews, because the Jews were looking for a king. Then we have Mark, the servant. The Romans were very familiar with the servants of that time. So to the Romans, it was Christ was pictured as a servant. And we'll go into much detail from the next class onwards. This is only an introductory class. Then the third, we see that Luke portrays him as a son of man, okay? Because the Greeks, they were looking for just a simple human being. And we see that, Luke focuses on the compassion and the works of Christ, okay? And Jesus coming to save that was lost. Then we see John, okay? John portrays Jesus as the Son of God, the eternal Word who came to reveal himself. So we have 4 pictures in the gospel. And then after the gospels, we have the letters of Paul, okay? So the letters of Paul, 13 letters he writes, and they can be split into 4 parts, okay? Letters that concern salvation, letters in prison, letters about the future, and letters to pastors, okay? So the letters to the pastors are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. The letters to the future is 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Then the letters from prison is Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Okay, and the letters to salvation is Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. Okay, so there we have 13. Then we have letters to everyone, that was Hebrews to Jude, and that was so in that also 3 letters are focusing on suffering. It is Hebrews, James, and First Peter. Then the remaining letters focus on false teachers. That was 2 Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. Okay, so so as the Romans began to rule, Nebuchadnezzar saw that that kingdom would be a divided kingdom. Okay, how it would be divided? Because people would not agree with the lawmakers of the kingdom, and what would happen was that the morals of the society would degenerate over time. So the people would be doing their own things. So so this is what is happening. Okay, many false teachers, false Christ would come, and much suffering and everything. So this is the world that Jesus was born in. And then lastly, we have Revelation. There's 3 things to point out about Revelation as an introduction. Is that firstly, it is an apocalyptic, like it reveals something. Okay, it's an unveiling of something. That is one. Okay, then second, it is a book of prophecy. Like the books of prophecy could be the prophets, the minor and the major prophets. The first point that I said was that it was a revelation. So for revelation, we have like Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah. people that are unveiling events, okay, that will happen. And then we have prophecy. And then thirdly, this book is written to the 12 churches of Revelation. Okay, even though we have the whole book, the book is basically written to the churches of Revelation. Okay, so seven churches. Sorry, I said 12, right? Seven churches of Revelation. And so as we see the close of Revelation, okay, Revelation gives us a picture that even though there's evil in this world, God triumphs over Satan and the battle has already been won. That's the closing moments of Revelation. Very powerful. And then he gives us, after that, a glimpse into what heaven is like. Okay. And then the book of Revelation closes. So this is just a tip of what we'll be studying. And then this is the introductory class.